The archives were my sanctuary, a hushed mausoleum of forgotten whispers and silent truths. Here, among the serried ranks of leather-bound ledgers and brittle parchment, I, Raj, found my solace. Each morning, the ritual began precisely. The clinking of my teacup against its saucer, the soft thump of the heavy door closing behind me, sealing the world away. My fingers, nimble and precise, moved with an almost liturgical grace over the spines, seeking out the misplaced, cataloging the new, restoring the delicate balance of order. My life was a meticulously cross-referenced index, every entry accounted for, every fact anchored to its proper place in time. The scent of aged paper, a dry, sweet dust, was the perfume of my existence. A quiet testament to lives lived and lessons learned, all neatly filed. The arrival of the new acquisitions, however, brought with it a subtle tremor in this carefully constructed piece. 3 large wooden crates, rough-hewn and smelling faintly of damp earth and something acrid, sat incongruously on the polished floorboards of the receiving bay. They had been salvaged, the accompanying manifest stated, from a long-sealed vault beneath a derelict factory, slated for demolition in a distant, unnamed district. My initial assessment was purely professional, a challenging but ultimately rewarding task of restoration and integration. I began with the first crate, its contents a predictable mix of mid-19th century ledgers detailing shipping manifests and a collection of faded architectural drawings. My gloved hands worked with practiced efficiency, brushing away layers of fine, dark dust, carefully unfolding brittle maps. It was then, tucked beneath a sheaf of blueprints for a long-demolished textile mill, that I found the first anomaly. The paper within was thick, almost pulpy, and the script, a looping, elegant hand, dated it unequivocally to the early 1700s. Yet nestled between its pages was a photograph, a daguerreotype perhaps. The image itself was startlingly clear, depicting a group of stern-faced individuals gathered before a structure that bore an unsettling resemblance to a sketch I had just catalogued from the textile mill plans, albeit from a century and a half later. A minor misfiling, I reasoned, a careless error by the previous custodian. I set it aside, a tiny pebble in the vast ocean of my work, to be corrected later. But the pebbles began to multiply. From the second crate, amidst documents pertaining to land deeds from the late 1800s, I unearthed a series of charcoal sketches. They depicted strange, angular symbols, almost glyphs, surrounding crude depictions of human figures engaged in what appeared to be some form of ritual. The unsettling part was not the content itself, but the paper, a distinct watermark, identical to one I had just seen on an early 20th century government decree. How could sketches from an earlier period be on paper from a later one? My brow furrowed. My meticulous mind, accustomed to the logical progression of time, felt a faint tremor of disquiet. This was beyond a simple misfiling. This was impossible. The third crate yielded the true unraveling. It contained not disparate items, but a cohesive collection, bound together by an unseen thread. There were fragmented diary entries, spanning what seemed like centuries, all written in different hands, yet describing eerily similar events. Not standard cartographic surveys, but intricate, almost artistic renderings of landscapes, overlaid with the same angular glyphs from the charcoal sketches. Each map, despite its different style and apparent age, seemed to converge on a single recurring point. A cluster of markings that, disturbingly, aligned with the precise location of my ancestral village. And within that village, a specific unlabeled parcel of land, marked only by a series of concentric circles. My breath caught in my throat. My hands, usually so steady, trembled as I laid out the documents, forming a mosaic of impossible connections. A hidden lineage, hinted at by recurring family names across centuries, all linked to this same location, this same implied purpose. The careful edifice of my orderly world began to fracture, hairline cracks appearing in the pristine plaster of my understanding. These were not just anomalies. They were an intentional defiance of chronology, a deliberate weaving of disparate eras into a single sinister tapestry. The air, once comforting in its stillness, now felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken secrets. I gathered the documents, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and locked them away, not in their designated places, but in a secure, isolated drawer, as if their mere proximity to other truthful histories might contaminate them. I left the archives, the quiet hum of the ventilation system a mocking echo of my racing thoughts. The streetlights outside cast a sickly yellow glow, blurring the familiar lines of the city. I walked, my mind a whirlpool of dates and symbols, until I reached my own doorstep. The key turned with a grating sound, louder than usual, and I stepped inside. The air in my home was stagnant, thick with the scent of unmoving air. Despite the open windows, I was certain I had left that morning. I moved through the familiar rooms, but something was subtly, profoundly wrong. The armchair in the living room seemed to have shifted, angled away from the window, facing the empty hearth. The small ceramic vase on the mantelpiece, usually a vibrant splash of color, was gone. My collection of first editions on the bookshelf, usually arranged by publication date, now seemed to be in disarray, a copy of an 18th century treatise nestled awkwardly next to a modern biography. This was my childhood home, yet it was slightly wrong rooms in the wrong order, objects subtly misplaced, a disquieting rearrangement that defied logic. The meticulous order I cherished, the very foundation of my identity, felt suddenly porous, invaded. The documents from the archives had not just revealed a hidden history. They had opened a door, and something, unseen and insidious, had slipped through. The rustle of aged parchment became the only companion in my small apartment, each brittle sheet a testament to forgotten hands. The maps, particularly, drew me in with a magnetic pull, their lines not merely geographic but almost organic, as if veins pulsed beneath the faded ink. They spoke of a landscape I thought I knew, my ancestral village, yet depicted it with an unsettling overlay of angular glyphs and concentric circles. These were not the tidy, numbered grids of modern cartography. They were keys to a lock I hadn't known existed. My days blurred into a single, extended vigil over the documents. I tried to impose order, to categorize the charcoal sketches, the faded letters, the fragmented journals, but they resisted. Each piece seemed to whisper of the others, hinting at connections that shimmered just beyond my grasp. The script, a variant I recognized from obscure historical texts, spoke of lineage, of earthbound energies, and of a gathering place. A phrase that recurred with an unnerving frequency. My fingers, stained with the dust of centuries, traced the contours of what I now suspected was a ritual site, its location marked by that same cluster of glyphs on every map, regardless of its apparent origin or artist. Sleep, when it came, offered no respite. It was no longer the peaceful descent into oblivion, but a doorway into a realm that felt increasingly real. Then they sharpened, coalescing into vivid, recurring sequences. Always, I would reach a particular doorway, one that led not to the garden as it should, but into a cavernous, earth-walled chamber. The air there was heavy, ancient, tasting of iron and something else, something metallic and sweet, like wilting flowers. Stone pillars, crudely hewn yet imbued with an undeniable presence, rose towards an unseen ceiling, their surfaces etched with the same glyphs that now populated my waking hours. I never saw anything on it, but the feeling of something having been there, something vast and hungry, was overwhelming. The dreams bled into my waking life, seeping into the edges of my perception. At first, it was just the feeling of being watched, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck when I was alone in my apartment, surrounded by the silent witnesses of the documents. Fleeting, almost imperceptible, they would manifest as a rustling behind me when no breeze stirred, a murmur of voices just beyond the threshold of hearing. But the regularity with which they occurred, the way they seemed to emanate from the very air around the documents, began to chip away at my resolve. I froze, my breath catching, the deed clutched tight in my hand. The air in the room grew heavy, almost viscous, and for a terrifying moment, I felt as if something immense and unseen had materialized directly behind me, its presence a suffocating weight. I didn't turn. I couldn't. The fear was a physical entity, pinning me to my chair. My once predictable routine, a comforting anchor in my solitary life, began to fray. The precision that defined me, the meticulous order of my archivist's mind, was slowly being eroded by a pervasive unease. They were no longer just symbols. They felt like eyes, observing me, drawing me deeper into a narrative I was only just beginning to comprehend. It was something that could reach out, something that could claim you, and it was reaching for me. My fingers traced the contours of an ancient, unnamed village, its pathways winding like dried riverbeds, its structures sketched with an unfamiliar, almost alien geometry. A shiver, not of cold, but of recognition, crawled up my spine. I had seen this village before, or fragments of it, in the sepia tones of my grandmother's old photographs, in the hushed, half-whispered stories of my childhood. But the maps presented it differently, overlaying it with symbols I could not decipher. A lattice of strange markings that seemed to throb with a silent, unseen energy. One particular symbol, a spiral unfurling into an eye, recurred with an unnerving persistence, etched onto the oldest vellum, branded into the margins of ledgers filled with cryptic notations. It was a mark I had dismissed as mere decorative flourish in earlier documents. But here, in the context of these ritualistic charts, it hummed with malevolence. Days bled into nights. The scent of old paper and dust became the very air I breathed. The glow of my desk lamp a solitary star in a deepening cosmos of obsession. The names, at first, were a jumble of faded script, but a pattern began to emerge. Surnames, archaic and almost forgotten, yet undeniably familiar, started to repeat. And then, a tremor ran through my hand as I found it. My own family name, spelled in an older, more elaborate script, nestled within a list of guardians, or perhaps supplicants, attached to a document describing the upkeep of a sacred ground. The sacred ground. The maps depicted it not as a temple or a shrine, but as a circular clearing, deep within a copse of gnarled, ancient trees, marked unmistakably by that same spiral eye symbol. A knot tightened in my gut. I knew that copse. It bordered the forgotten fields behind my ancestral home, a place I had been forbidden to enter as a child, warned away by my grandfather with a severity that still echoed in my memory. He called it the Old Woods, his voice hushed, his gaze distant, as if seeing specters. The connection solidified, concrete, and terrifying. My family, my lineage, was not merely from this remote village. It was woven into the very fabric of these rituals, these strange observations, this hidden history. And the final, most horrifying revelation came in a small, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle as autumn leaves. A crude drawing, a floor plan of a house. My house. The childhood home, abandoned for decades, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the wilderness. It was an uncanny valley in architectural form. This was no longer an academic pursuit. This was personal. It craved memory, the premise stated. And here, in these documents, was a memory unearthed, a forgotten truth stirring in its sleep. Was I merely a vessel, a tool for its awakening? The thought was a venomous bite, but it did not deter me. Instead, it fueled a morbid, consuming curiosity. My determination, once a steady flame, now flickered with a desperate, feverish energy. I had to go. I had to walk those pathways, to stand in that clearing, to confront the distorted reflection of my own home, The questions clawed at my mind, sharp and relentless. What lay within that abandoned structure? What secrets had my ancestors guarded, and what horrors had they perpetuated? What did the documents mean by the keeping of the threshold? I began to pack, my movements precise, almost ritualistic themselves. A backpack, a few essentials, the crucial documents carefully secured. The familiar comfort of my apartment felt suddenly alien, a temporary refuge from a truth that had waited centuries to be known. The city lights outside my window seemed dim, irrelevant. All that mattered was the journey, the descent into a past that was not merely history, but a living, breathing thing reaching out for me. The remote village, nestled deep within the forgotten folds of the land, beckoned. The road, once a familiar ribbon of asphalt, had frayed into a tattered thread, swallowed by encroaching weeds and the patient hunger of the earth. My old sedan groaned over the ruts, each jolt a subtle complaint against this forgotten path. The trees, skeletal sentinels, pressed in closer here, their branches weaving a canopy that choked the sunlight, casting the approach to the village in perpetual twilight. I remember the village as a place of muted laughter and the hum of distant tractors, a patchwork of small homes nestled against the vast whispering fields. What greeted me now was a tableau of decay, a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Paint peeled from warped timbers, revealing the gray, withered flesh beneath. The main street, once a modest thoroughfare, was now a gravel track where wild grasses fought for dominance. There were no children's shouts, no barking dogs, no distant clatter of pots from open kitchens, just the sigh of the wind through broken panes and the rustle of dry leaves skittering across empty thresholds. A flicker of movement caught my eye. An elderly woman, her back stooped like a question mark, stood by what remained of a fence, her gaze fixed on the horizon. As I drove past, she turned slowly, her eyes, milky with age, met mine. There was no recognition, only an unsettling depth, a sorrow that seemed to precede her. She didn't wave, didn't nod. She simply watched me pass, a silent sentinel in a dying world. I parked near the village well, its stone lip chipped and stained. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the loose gravel, an intrusion in the pervasive quiet. It looked wrong. The windows were blank, the porch sagged, but it was more than just disrepair. As I approached, a wave of disorientation washed over me. But the layout, it was a subtle distortion, a cruel trick of memory. The staircase, I remembered it turning right, towards the landing. Now, it angled left, leading into a deeper gloom. The living room, which should have been to my immediate left, was now a cramped antechamber, the door to the kitchen missing entirely. This wasn't just decay, it was an active rearrangement, a subtle shifting of reality designed to unmoor me. I gripped the doorframe, my knuckles white. I needed to find the path to the copse, to the sacred ground. The maps had been clear, the symbol unmistakable. Was this real? Or was the entity already at work, twisting my perceptions, eroding the very foundation of what I knew? I found a figure in the dim light of what should have been the kitchen, but was now a bare, windowless room. An old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, sat on a stool, meticulously carving a small wooden bird. He didn't look up as I entered, his gnarled fingers moving with an unnerving precision. "The path," I began, my voice hoarse, "to the clearing, the old trees." He paused, the knife resting against the uncarved wood. "The old trees," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves scuttling across stone. "They watch. They remember." He held up the half-carved bird. "It takes what is given, and it gives what is taken." A shiver traced its way down my spine. "What do you mean?" He lowered his gaze, returning to his carving. "The spiral eye," he murmured, almost to himself. "It sees the past. It sees the future. but it forgets the present. He glanced up again, a flicker of something akin to pity in his eyes. You seek what is lost, Raj, but some things are lost for a reason. His words, fragmented and ominous, hung heavy in the air. The thrumming in my bones intensified, a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to synchronize with the old man's slow, deliberate carving. I wanted to ask more, to press him for details, but his gaze had returned to the wood, a silent dismissal. As I turned to leave, the walls of the room seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting almost imperceptibly. The light, already dim, flickered, though there was no lamp, no source of illumination other than the distant, weak daylight filtering through the front door. For a terrifying moment, the floor beneath me felt like shifting sand, my balance wavering. I closed my eyes, fighting the vertigo, the insidious creep of unreality. When I opened them, the room had settled, but the sensation of being watched, of being unmade, persisted. The path to the cops, I knew, lay beyond the forgotten fields. But leaving the house, I felt a profound sense of wrongness. The village itself, in the encroaching gloom, transformed into a collection of gaping mouths and accusing eyes. His words, fragmented and ominous, hung heavy in the air. As I turned from the stoic figure, the silence of the village pressed in, a weight that promised answers only to those brave enough to seek them in the shadowed corners of their own past. My path was clear, if terrifyingly uncertain. Back to the ancestral home, to the place where my own story began, and where the documents hinted at a lineage woven into the fabric of this forgotten land. The walk felt longer than it ever had, the familiar cobblestones now seeming to shift underfoot. Each step a further descent into a landscape both known and utterly alien. A pallid, bruised light bled from the sky as I approached the weathered stone walls of my family's house, a structure that had stood for generations, a silent sentinel of time. Yet, even from the outside, a subtle discord hummed in the air, a whisper of something amiss. Pushing open the heavy oak door, the scent of dust and ancient wood met me, a comfort that quickly curdled into unease. Wrong. The entryway, once a welcoming space, now stretched unnaturally long, its dimensions subtly warped. I stepped further inside, the floorboards creaking a hesitant protest beneath my weight. The living room, typically to my left, was gone, replaced by what appeared to be a narrow, unlit corridor I had no memory of. This was it, then. The documents had spoken of a place that defied logic, a site veiled by a peculiar geometry. A tremor passed through me, not just of fear, but of a strange, almost giddy apprehension. If the house itself was a puzzle, perhaps the key lay in its distortion. The kitchen, usually a bright, sun-filled space, now sat where the library should have been, its familiar stove and worn countertop bathed in an unnatural gray twilight. But even stranger, the pantry door, normally a simple wooden panel, was now a heavy, iron-studded slab, utterly out of place. The faint, earthy smell was stronger here. I pushed, and with a groan that seemed to echo from deep within the earth, the iron door swung inward. It didn't open into a pantry. This was the hidden chamber, the ritual site, I was certain. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my hands, steady despite the internal tremor, found the oil lamp I always kept by the old fireplace, now inexplicably located in what should have been the dining room. The passage opened into a vast, cavernous space, its walls crude and unadorned, yet bearing the unmistakable marks of human hands. In the center, a large, flat stone slab dominated the space, its surface scarred with intricate spiraling grooves. Around it, smaller stones formed a rough circle, each one imbued with a sense of forgotten purpose. This was it, the place of ancient communion, the heart of the mystery. As I stood before the slab, A strange, dizzying sensation swept over me. I reached out a hand, intending to touch the cold stone, but paused. Why was I here? What was I looking for? The question hung in the air, formless and unsettling. I knew the answer, of course. I was Raj, an archivist. I was here because of the documents, the lineage, the forgotten ritual. It hovered at the edge of my consciousness, a phantom limb of memory, but refused to solidify. Then a more profound jolt. My own name. Raj. I repeated it aloud, testing its sound, its familiarity. It felt distant, as if I were calling out to someone else. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to grasp the fading threads of my past. My work, the meticulous cataloging of forgotten histories, the quiet routine of my life. Where was it? It was there, just beyond reach, like words on a page seen through distorting water. The faces of my parents, their laughter, the scent of my mother's cooking. They flickered, insubstantial and fragile. The stone slab pulsed with a faint internal glow, mirroring the insistent thrum in my skull. Who was I? Why did the details of my life feel like borrowed fragments? My identity, my very self, was unraveling, thread by delicate thread. I was becoming a ghost in my own story, a stranger to the man I once was, standing in a place that twisted and contorted not just space, but time itself. The old man's words had burrowed beneath my skin, an insidious seed germinating in the fertile ground of my disquiet. The threads unwind, the shape forgotten. His rhythmic carving, a dull rasp against wood, echoed in the hollows of my skull, a phantom thrumming that never quite receded. But the world had begun to fray at the edges, a tapestry unpicked by unseen hands. First, it was subtle, a whisper of confusion. I reached for a file, its label momentarily alien. Each entry was a desperate bulwark against the rising tide of nothingness. Yet the tide rose. I looked at my own reflection, and the eyes staring back held a glint of unfamiliarity, a question mark hovering where certainty should reside. The names I wrote sometimes felt like borrowed words, the memories like borrowed clothes, ill-fitting and strange. It wasn't forgetfulness, it was erasure, a meticulous scraping away of the very essence of Raj. It was the last bastion, the sanctuary of first memories, of foundational truths. The drive was a blur, the familiar route feeling less like a path I'd trodden countless times and more like a maze I was navigating for the first time. When I pulled up, the house stood solid, its weathered brick facade a stoic guardian against the years. Yet, as I stepped onto the porch, a prickle of unease traced my spine. The porch swing, usually hanging by the oak, was gone. No, not gone, but moved. It now swayed gently from the far end, beneath the kitchen window where no swing had ever hung. I pushed open the door, the familiar creak a comfort until the interior revealed itself. My breath caught in my throat. Terribly, fundamentally wrong. The living room, usually to my right, was now a small, cramped study, shelves filled with books I'd never seen. The fireplace, once central, was absent. I walked further, my steps tentative on the worn floorboards that felt alien beneath my feet. The kitchen, where countless meals had been shared, was now a large, empty space, its windows boarded up, casting the room into a perpetual twilight. Panic began to bloom, a thorny vine climbing through my chest. This wasn't just a memory lapse. This was a physical manifestation of the erasure, a tangible distortion of reality. I stumbled into what should have been my parents' bedroom, but it was my own childhood room, yet rearranged. The bed by a window that had never existed. A faded tapestry on the wall depicting a swirling vortex, a design utterly foreign to my memory. My own room, where the toy chest had always sat by the closet, was now a small, forgotten pantry, smelling faintly of dust and something metallic, like old blood. I sank to the floor, my hands pressed against my temples, a desperate attempt to hold the pieces together. My memories warred with the physical space. Was I wrong? Had I remembered it incorrectly all these years? My gaze fell upon a loose floorboard near the hearth, a hearth that shouldn't have been there. My fingers, trembling, pried it up. Its cover was aged, the leather cracked like sun-baked skin. It was my own handwriting, or a hand so similar it was indistinguishable. The entries spoke of rituals, of offerings, of a lineage tasked with guarding something ancient, something that fed on the dissolution of boundaries. Then, a page, a drawing, and beneath it, a name etched in bold, confident strokes. Raj. My name. But it wasn't a record of me as a victim. The words around the drawing spoke not of a curse, but of a duty, of a chosen one, a vessel whose memories would be offered, whose identity would be absorbed to fuel the entity's return, to bridge the gap between worlds. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a revelation that clawed at the foundations of my very existence. I wasn't just observing the horror. I was its inheritor, its unwilling participant. My lineage, the village, the entity. It was all intertwined, and I was the final terrifying piece. The unraveling wasn't happening to me. It was happening through me, a grim, inherited purpose unfolding with every forgotten name, every twisted room. The entity wasn't just consuming my memories, it was consuming me, for a reason far older and more monstrous than I could have ever conceived. I was not just losing myself, I was becoming the gateway. The threads unwind. It was a melody of unraveling, a promise whispered by a mouth too close to my ear. The hallway, once a straight shot to the kitchen, now seemed to bend at an unnatural angle, leading to a door that should have opened into a linen closet, but instead revealed a sliver of what looked like my grandmother's old sewing room, long since converted. The pantry, usually to my left, had shifted to the right, a minor displacement that nonetheless sent a shiver of wrongness through me. One particular scroll, its vellum yellowed to the color of old bone, spoke of the great unmaking, a process not of destruction, but of reformation. It described a lineage not of blood, but of memory, a succession of vessels prepared to receive something ancient, something that had been forgotten by the waking world. To dissolve the self, one passage read, rendered in a hand so precise it seemed etched rather than inked, is to become the vessel. To shed the skin of identity is to inherit the mantle of true remembrance. I traced the words with a trembling finger, the parchment cool beneath my touch, yet radiating an odd heat. My own fragmented past, my eroding present, were merely tributaries flowing into a terrifying ancient river. And the ritual was the confluence. As I pieced together more passages, the horrifying truth began to coalesce. It was not an appeasement, not a banishment. It was an invitation, a merging. The entity, in its hunger for memory and identity, offered a twisted form of immortality, a permanence within its own being. To complete the ritual was to offer oneself entirely, to surrender the last vestiges of self, and in doing so, to become a part of its eternal, shapeless form. To become it. Their hands were raised, not in supplication, but in offering, their forms shimmering, dissolving into the pulsing light, their individualities folding into a greater, featureless whole. It was not violent, not painful, but a profound, almost serene dissolution. The horror was immense, an icy claw tightening around my chest, yet beneath it, a strange, undeniable allure began to bloom. My own identity was already a tattered flag, whipping in the winds of forgetting. My memories were dissolving like sugar in water. What was left to lose? And what if, in this terrifying surrender, I could find a different kind of wholeness? A warped, monstrous connection to something ancient and enduring, a permanence that my fleeting human self could never achieve? It was not a logical thought, but a primal, instinctual pull, a resonance with something deep within the texts, deep within the shifting walls of my home, deep within me. The entity wasn't just erasing me. It was calling to me, seducing me with the promise of belonging, however horrific. The rasping sound of the old man's carving returned, not as an echo, but as a felt vibration in the floorboards beneath my feet. The threads unwind, the shape forgotten. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a blueprint. My own fragmented past, my eroding present, they were not merely fading echoes. No, the truth, a chilling revelation that crawled like frost across my spine, was far more insidious. My very essence was becoming raw material. A furious, desperate determination surged through me, a last defiant flame against the encroaching tide. I would resist. I would not be remade. My breath hitched in my throat, a ragged sound in the oppressive stillness of my small, rented room in the village. I gripped the edge of the rough-hewn table, my knuckles white, the splintered wood digging into my palm. Escape. That was the only thought that held coherence. Escape the village, escape the documents, escape the creeping horror that had begun to wear my face. I moved with a frantic energy, snatching a worn satchel from a peg on the wall. A few changes of clothes, a half-eaten loaf of bread, the small, leather-bound journal where I had meticulously recorded my findings. I shoved them in, my movements clumsy, propelled by a primal urge to flee. As I reached for the door, my hand hesitated, hovering inches from the latch. A subtle shift in the light, a flicker at the periphery of my vision, drew my gaze. But it was wrong. The petals were too sharp, too numerous, and the central seed pod pulsed with a faint, unholy luminescence. I blinked, hard. The carving vanished, replaced by the simple, scarred wood. The hallway, which should have led directly to the rickety stairs, instead opened onto a wide, sun-drenched space. But the layout was subtly, terrifyingly askew. The grand fireplace, a focal point of comfort and warmth in my memories, now stood in the far corner, dwarfed and distorted, its mantelpiece empty of the familiar photographs. The armchair where my father would read sat facing a blank wall, its back to the phantom window. I spun around, my satchel falling with a dull thud. Standing by the phantom fireplace was a figure, indistinct at first, then sharpening into the image of my mother. Her sari, a vibrant blue, seemed to ripple and shift, its colors bleeding into the air. You always return. No, I choked out, stumbling backward. My hands scrabbled for something to hold, something real. The wall behind me felt oddly yielding, like damp earth. This isn't real. You're not real. The figure of my mother smiled, a slow, predatory curve of the lips that never reached her eyes. We are as real as you allow us to be. We are the memories you cherish, the past you cling to, and we are hungry. The room began to twist around me. The wallpaper patterns writhed like entangled snakes. The scent of lilies intensified, sickly sweet, laced now with the metallic tang of something ancient and forgotten. Then, the world solidified, but into something far worse. Before me, a shallow depression in the ground, precisely the size and shape described in the oldest parchments. My hands, I realized with a profound, sickening horror, were stained. I looked down at my left arm. Clutched in my right hand was a small, sharp piece of flint, crudely fashioned, yet undeniably keen. On my forearm, etched into my skin, were 3 fresh, shallow cuts, perfectly parallel, just beneath the faint scar of a childhood fall. The cuts bled sluggishly, the crimson seeping into the pores of my skin, mirroring the ancient symbols I had seen in the cursed documents. I had done this. My own hands, guided by an invisible, insidious will, had performed a grotesque mimicry of the ancient ritual. My mind, my very body, had become a puppet. You are not merely absorbing our past, Raj. You are becoming the past. Your identity, your memories, they are not consumed. They are merely rearranged to serve. The realization struck me like a physical blow, stripping away the last vestiges of my self-control. This wasn't about erasing me. It was about rebuilding me, transforming me into a living conduit, a flesh and blood repository for the entity's vast collective consciousness, all for the purpose of completing the forgotten ritual. My resistance had been a futile dance, my determination a mere echo. I was not fighting to escape. I was fighting to remain me. And I was losing. The flint dropped from my numb fingers, landing with a soft thud on the disturbed earth. My own mind, weaponized against me, had become my most terrifying enemy. I was utterly alone, adrift in a reality woven from my own stolen memories, a prisoner in a body that was no longer entirely my own. The ground beneath me felt less like solid earth and more like the shifting sands of a forgotten dream. My own name, Raj, was a whisper on the wind, a sound that no longer resonated with the core of my being. My memories, once meticulously cataloged and filed, now swirled in a chaotic maelstrom, fragments of faces, half-heard conversations, and the persistent, chilling presence of something vast and hungry. It was not a physical force, but a deep, ancestral current, guiding my feet along paths I had never consciously walked, yet knew intimately. My vision blurred at the periphery, the world around me shimmering, as if seen through a heat haze that warped not just light, but time itself. The wallpaper, once a cheerful floral pattern, was now a faded tapestry of indistinct shifting shapes, like faces caught in perpetual agony. I reached out to touch a familiar wooden doorframe, but my fingers passed through it, leaving no impression. It was a ghost of a memory, a stage set for a play I was no longer sure I was the protagonist of. This was not my home. It was a reflection, twisted and distorted, of the self that was rapidly dissolving. The entity was not merely invading my mind. It was reshaping my very perception of reality, using the most intimate landscapes of my past against me. The unsettling journey through the distorted house eventually dissolved, replaced by the stark reality of the ancient path. Twisted roots, thick as a man's arm, snaked across the ground, tripping hazards in the fading light. The trees here were skeletal, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers towards a sky that was turning a bruised purple. It was the hum of something vast, something awakening. Then I saw it, the ritual site. They writhed, coalescing into forms that were almost but not quite human. Faces flickered within them, faces I had never seen, yet felt an ancient kinship with. My grandfather's stern gaze, a distant relative's gentle smile, a woman with eyes that mirrored my own, all caught in a perpetual silent scream. What emerged then was not a single form, but a confluence, a living tapestry woven from the countless threads of my ancestry. It was immense, formless yet defined by the sheer weight of its presence. It had no eyes, no mouth, yet I felt its gaze, heard its voice not in my ears, but directly within the deepest chambers of my skull. Raj, it resonated, the sound tearing through the fragile remnants of my identity. You are the confluence, the final vessel. This was its true form, not a singular entity, but the accumulated consciousness of my entire bloodline, corrupted and twisted, reaching across the chasm of time. It had been slumbering, feeding on the forgotten, waiting for the perfect host, the precise intersection of memory and identity. And I, Raj, the archivist, the keeper of records, was that intersection. Your memories, the voice thrummed, are the final key, your identity the bridge. Through you, the ancient pact will be fulfilled. We will cross. We will be whole. It wanted to fully assimilate me, to make me a permanent part of its vast, unholy consciousness. I was not just a conduit. I was the final lock, and it held the key. My existence was a sacrifice, my identity a fuel. Terror, raw and primal, surged through me, a last desperate gasp from the self I was losing. And I, Raj, was to be the unwilling bridge. The air itself was thick, like breathing silt, each inhale a struggle against the growing pressure in my skull. The scent of damp earth and something acrid, metallic, clung to the phantom wallpaper, a smell that spoke of forgotten rituals and the slow decay of centuries. The banister, once smooth wood, felt like rough, splintered bone beneath my trembling fingers. The floorboards groaned, not with age, but with a deeper, more resonant agony, as if the very structure was being stretched, rewoven, to accommodate something vast and unnameable. My memories, once meticulous archives, were now dissolving like ink in water. Raj, archivist, son, man. Each word was a shield, weakening, cracking under an immense, unseen force. The faint, persistent hum I had grown accustomed to now intensified. A low thrumming that resonated in my teeth, in my chest. A tuning fork struck against the very core of reality. It was a sound that didn't just vibrate the air, but the very concept of existence. Then, a reveal. The lineage wasn't merely a bloodline, a historical curiosity I had unearthed. It was a conduit, a carefully cultivated channel. The ritual site in the village, the documents I'd obsessed over, they weren't just records of a past event. They were instructions, a blueprint for this, for me. I was not merely an unwitting victim. I was the culmination, the final necessary piece. My connection wasn't just to the ancient horror, but as the ancient horror. The meticulous archivist, dedicated to preserving the past, had unwittingly become the key to its terrible reawakening. A chasm opened not in the floorboards, but within my own understanding. The entity didn't just want to possess me, it wanted to be me, to wear my skin, to inhabit my life. But with its vast, ageless consciousness now tethered to the physical world through my inherited vessel. The walls breathed, a slow, deliberate expansion and contraction that filled the space with the stale, metallic smell. I saw, with a clarity that pierced the fog of dissolving memories, a vision not from my own past, but from an age beyond human reckoning. I saw the faces of my forebears, a long line of them, each one a step closer, a refinement of the vessel. They had not been victims, not entirely. They had been custodians, preparing the way, each generation a subtle shift, a genetic alignment, a psychic attunement. And now, in me, the cycle was complete. My past, my present, my future all became raw material, threads unraveling from the tapestry of Raj and being rewoven into something monstrously grand. The room around me blurred, the edges of the walls softening, the ceiling rippling like water. My hands, when I looked at them, seemed to shimmer, translucent at the edges, as if they were fading from existence even as they were being reforged. I was becoming, not dissolving. I was being rebuilt, molecule by molecule, memory by memory, into something that was not Raj, yet undeniably from Raj. The entity was not merely emerging, it was becoming through me, taking my life, my history, my very essence as its new physical form. The final sacrifice was not a life, but an identity, meticulously erased, then repurposed. A profound, terrible awareness bloomed in the place where my individual thoughts had been, a vast, ancient consciousness unfurling, stretching, finally touching the physical world. And a sliver of me, Raj, the archivist, the man who had sought the truth, was still there. a tiny, terrified spark trapped within the colossal, terrible awakening. The first sensation was not pain, but a profound, chilling emptiness. It began in the hollows behind my eyes, a vast, desolate space where my thoughts once resided, then spread, like a silent frost, through the sinews of my mind. My very being felt like a drum, struck once, and now resonating with a sound that was not its own. I opened my eyes, or perhaps they simply opened, no longer truly mine to command. The world was a canvas of muted greens and browns, a familiar palette, yet profoundly wrong. I lay on a threadbare rug, the coarse fibers scratching against my cheek. This was the living room. Or it should have been. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the floorboards beneath me, a persistent hum that seemed to vibrate not just the wood, but the very air. I pushed myself up, my limbs moving with an unfamiliar grace, a smoothness that felt alien. My gaze swept across the space. This was my childhood home, slightly wrong rooms in the wrong order. The large bay window, usually overlooking the overgrown garden, was now a solid wall of aged, peeling wallpaper. Where the dining room should have been, a narrow, dark hallway stretched into an impossible distance, its end obscured by shadows that seemed to drink the light. A mirror hung on what should have been the kitchen door. I approached it, my footsteps unnervingly silent. The reflection that greeted me was undeniably my own. Raj, with the same sharp nose, the same tired eyes. Yet, the eyes were different. They held a depth that was not weariness, but an ancient, unblinking awareness. My pupils seemed to dilate and contract independently, like twin moons shifting in a clouded sky. And in their depths, I saw not my own fleeting memories, but glimmers of vast, forgotten landscapes, of rituals enacted under stars that no longer burned. My reflection blinked, but I did not. A whisper, like wind through dry leaves, drifted from the dark hallway. It was not a sound I heard with my ears, but rather a sensation, a vibration in the marrow of my bones. It spoke of forgotten names, of soil turned under a cruel sun, of a lineage unbroken yet utterly transformed. I was no longer merely Raj, the meticulous archivist. I was a vessel, a repository. My mind, once a carefully catalogued library of personal history, was now a vast echoing chamber, holding not just my own scattered remnants, but the aggregated consciousness of something ancient and terrible. I walked towards the impossible hallway, drawn by a compulsion I could not resist. Each step was deliberate, unhurried, as if my body understood a purpose I had yet to grasp. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and something akin to blooming nightshade. My memories, the vibrant tapestry of my life, were fading, replaced by an influx of images that were not mine. Hands stained with earth, faces contorted in forgotten chants, the slow, rhythmic beat of a drum echoing from deep within the earth. This was the reveal. The entity had not merely invaded, it had assimilated. It had not destroyed me, but overwritten me, a palimpsest where my fragile script now lay beneath its colossal ancient text. The horror was not in the death, but in the continuation, the terrifying persistence of me, yet utterly not me. My own thoughts were fleeting, like wisps of smoke, trying to cling to the precipice of my awareness, only to be swept away by the surging tide of ancestral consciousness. A low, continuous thrum emanated from within, a sound that resonated with the very core of my being. It was the sound of completion, of an ancient cycle fulfilled. This was the event, the final manifestation, the crossing. The dreamlike existence had found its physical anchor, and that anchor was me. And around it, etched into the very floor, were the symbols I had uncovered in the ancient texts, the sigils of the forgotten ritual site, now pulsing with a faint internal energy. My hand, no longer truly my own, reached out, drawn by an unseen force towards the altar. My memories flickered. My mother's laugh, the warmth of the sun on my face, the quiet satisfaction of finding a perfectly preserved document. They were distant, like echoes from a foreign land, already receding into the vast, ancient consciousness that now dominated my mind. It had found its host. It had not just corrupted the fabric of existence, but had found a way to weave itself into the very essence of human continuity. I felt a smile stretch across my lips, a smile that was not mine, filled with a terrible, ancient satisfaction. There was no victory, no escape, and what remained was an empty vessel, a new custodian of an ancient, unfolding horror, forever bound to the echo of what was and what now, terrifyingly, is.